They believed the castle would save them, but its walls killed more people than any invading army. Behind those stones were hunger, poison, smoke, and choices no one dared to speak aloud. Every chamber hid a truth darker than the battlefield outside. Tonight, you will walk with me through a fortress that became its own grave. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone were to stand before a medieval castle at the edge of a quiet morning, the sight would inspire a sense of certainty that few structures could offer. The high walls, the narrow windows, the heavy gate reinforced with iron all seemed to promise safety. From a distance, the stone appeared immovable, as if nothing in the world could break through it. People believed in these walls the way others believed in blessings. A fortress was not simply a building, it was the final shield between a community and the dangers beyond its borders. Generations grew up hearing that, once the gate closed, nothing harmful could reach them. That belief shaped how people lived. Farmers brought their harvest inside when rumors of conflict spread. Merchants stored their goods in chambers deep within the inner ward. Families packed their belongings, trusting that once they stepped under the archway, the world outside could no longer touch them. The castle looked strong enough to withstand storms, armies, and time itself. It carried an authority that silenced fear, at least on the surface. The truth behind this confidence was simple. For most of history, walls meant survival. A village could be burned, but a stone keep remained standing long after flames died. Raiders could sweep across fields, but they often hesitated before towers too tall and gates too thick to break quickly. To the people who lived near one, the castle was a promise that someone powerful had built something meant to protect them. But even promises made of stone can hide what lies beneath. The strength people saw from outside rarely reflected the fragile systems within. A fortress was not a world of its own. It depended on food stored months before, on water drawn from a single well, on light that could barely reach the lower chambers. It depended on people who believed suffering was temporary, so long as the walls held. Every day, life inside the walls encouraged the illusion. Children played in the courtyard beneath watchtowers. Women fetched water from the well, as if the bucket would always come back full. Soldiers trained in the yard, their armor gleaming in the sun, gave an image of control. Even the shadows cast by the battlements seemed protective rather than ominous. Silence felt like peace, not warning. In peaceful times, the castle truly seemed unbreakable. People saw what they wanted to see: stone that had outlasted storms, gates that had repelled thieves, and towers that stood tall against the horizon. When travelers spoke of distant wars, locals reassured one another that such chaos could never reach them here. The walls were too high, the lord was too prepared, the village was too small to attract attention. Comfort came easily when the danger felt far away. Yet those same features, the walls, the gates, the single entry point, carried a darker potential. A structure designed to keep enemies out could just as easily keep inhabitants trapped inside. The narrow passages that slowed attackers also slowed escape. The thick walls that muted sound also muffled cries for help. The gates built to withstand battering could become barriers that no one inside could open once pressure mounted. In calm times, no one dwelt on these details. It was easier not to think about them. Most people living in or around a castle had never endured a true siege. Their understanding of danger was shaped by stories passed down. Stories in which the walls held firm until reinforcements arrived. These tales focused on bravery, on endurance, on the idea that fortresses always outmatched those who sought to breach them. Few spoke of the hunger, the sickness, or the fear that crept into corners where sunlight never reached. No one imagined that danger could rise from the inside, moving quietly long before enemies touched the gate. The early signs of vulnerability were small and easy to overlook. A storeroom is not filled enough. A well that had grown slightly murkier than usual. A faint smell in the lower chambers that people assumed would fade in time. These were not problems when life was peaceful, but when an army surrounded the walls and the gate slammed shut, every weakness that had once gone unnoticed began to matter. Inside a castle, space was limited. Every resident during a siege shared the same air, the same food, the same fears. The stone that protected them from the outside world also held them in close. Pressing hundreds of people into spaces never meant to hold so many. In these conditions, safety became an illusion, and illusions, when threatened, tend to crumble quickly. To understand why castles became death traps, one must begin with the belief that they could not. People trusted these structures too deeply. Mistaking the weight of stone for the weight of certainty, they saw only the surface, the majesty, the height, the strength, and never questioned what might happen if the very thing they relied on most became the source of their suffering. A castle promised protection, but it never promised escape. Walls were built to stop armies, not hunger. Gates were built to resist fire, not disease. Towers were built to watch for external threats, not the rising panic of those trapped below. Once the idea of safety settled into people's minds, it blinded them to the truth. Stone does not guarantee survival. When pressure closed in, the fortress that once felt like a sanctuary transformed into a cage, silent and absolute. The belief in the walls defined how people lived. Yet the walls themselves carried dangers no one wished to see. The quiet inside a fortress often held more truth than the noise outside its gates. And within that quiet, something far harsher was already waiting to be uncovered. The closed gate changed the meaning of everything inside the walls. What had once been a familiar courtyard became a sealed world with no pathways, no escape, and no reassurance. At first, people told themselves that closing the gate was simply part of defense. They had seen it done before during smaller threats, during storms, or when bandits roamed nearby. But this time was different. This time, the lock of iron and the heavy beam behind it signaled not temporary caution, but the start of an ending no one could name yet. Within a few days, the rhythms of daily life began to twist. Hunger appeared earlier each morning, no longer softened by the expectation of food arriving from the fields or nearby villages. Bread baked from the last sacks of grain grew thinner, harder, and less frequent. People who once shared meals openly now held their portions close, turning their bodies slightly away from the eyes of others. Every crumb seemed valuable. Every meal carried the quiet knowledge that it might not be repeated tomorrow. The feeling of entrapment grew heavier with each passing hour. No carts arrived with vegetables or meat. No herders reached the gate with milk or fresh cheese. No merchants approached with salt, spices, or barrels of stored goods. The castle, which had once felt connected to the countryside around it, now felt as though it floated alone in an empty landscape. Those inside could only stare down from the ramparts and see the enemy lines, patient and unmoving, sealing off every road. Even the sky seemed farther away. Illness did not wait long to settle in. It slipped quietly among the people, carried by exhaustion, is hunger, and shared air. What began as a few complaints, headaches, chills, stomach pains soon became something more sinister. Children curled against walls with fevered eyes. Adults grew pale, their breath short and pained. The narrow spaces of the castle did nothing to stop the spread. Walls meant to block arrows could not block disease. And disease, unlike soldiers, required no rest. The infirmary filled quickly, though it was hardly more than a shadowed room with a few wooden beds and the faint smell of old herbs. The healer, who had once treated wounds from farm accidents and minor sicknesses, now faced a rising tide of patients she could not help. Her supplies dwindled on the second day. By the fourth, she worked with only water and cloth. She moved from bed to bed with shaking hands, knowing each face she touched might be one she would later see carried out. Noise inside the castle began to change. Instead of laughter or the clatter of tools, there were muffled arguments, sudden shouts, and moments of frightening quiet. People tried to keep order, but fear reshaped every gesture. A dropped spoon could startle an entire room. A child crying for food made adults avert their eyes. Ashamed not for refusing, but for wanting to silence the sound. Even the soldiers' footsteps lost their usual confidence, dragging slightly as weariness seeped into them. The walls that once promised protection now felt like a barrier to hope. Every brick and every tower reminded the residents that they were sealed inside a place that could no longer sustain them. People glanced toward the gate, not with expectation, but with resentment. They remembered the moment it closed, the echo of finality. And now they understood what they could not grasp before, that the gate had not just kept the enemy out. It had locked them in with hunger, fear, and one another. The chaos was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, almost politely at first, as though giving people time to adjust to their fear. But hunger sharpened tensions. Illness weakened spirits, and the confined air carried dread from person to person. What had once been a community began to fracture. Neighbors who had shared tools only days earlier now avoided each other, each wary that the other might bring sickness. Or worse, desperation. By the 6th or 7th day, the castle felt like a living creature whose breath had turned toxic. Rooms smelled of sweat and damp cloth. Fires burned low to conserve wood, leaving shadows stretched and unsettling. People spoke in whispers, as if raising their voices might provoke something in the darkness. The fortress that once felt reassuring now pressed inward, narrowing, suffocating, reshaping their sense of reality. The walls were no longer merely stone, they had become limits. And all the while, the enemy outside waited without impatience. Their presence did not need to be loud. Their strategy required only time. They knew the walls would not kill them. They also knew the walls might kill those inside. Siege warfare rarely depended on swords. Hunger, illness, and fear did the work far more efficiently. Inside, everyone could sense the shift. It was in the way people walked more slowly, spoke less, and looked at the ground instead of the sky. It was in the way the courtyard echoed differently, carrying the sound of weakness instead of activity. The castle, once imagined as a fortress of strength, now felt like a cage built with their own misplaced trust. And somewhere behind those locked gates, the first signs of true ruin began to take form. The pressure inside the sealed fortress grew heavier than the threat waiting beyond its walls. A quiet tension settled into every corner, feeding on hunger and exhaustion. And within that tense silence, the earliest fractures of collapse began to widen. The siege tightened long before anyone inside realized how completely the outside world had vanished. From the highest tower, soldiers watched the enemy spread across the fields like a slow-moving tide, placing barricades, digging positions, and sealing every path that once carried life into the fortress. No messenger slipped through the woods. No merchant's cart rumbled toward the gate. No animals grazed near the walls. The land around the castle became a ring of silence broken only by the distant rhythm of enemy preparations. Inside, the absence of supply did not feel alarming at first. People comforted themselves with memories of past shortages. believing they had enough stored food to wait out the pressure. Barrels of grain, salted meat, dried vegetables. These things had once filled storerooms with the reassuring smell of preparation. But the fear of the siege changed how people ate. Meals shrank. Bread lost its softness. Pots simmered with more water than ingredients. And every serving carried the taste of uncertainty. What the castle possessed seemed plentiful only when no one measured it. The moment people began counting, the truth shifted sharply. Sacks of grain that had appeared heavy before now looked strangely thin. Barrels that once seemed full of salted meat revealed gaps at the bottom. Several stores, when opened, smelled faintly sour, their contents already spoiling from dampness that no one had noticed in calmer days. The more they checked, the more they realized how fragile their safety had been, even before the siege began. The first signs of hunger appeared quietly. Children searched the ground for crumbs after meals. Adults chewed more slowly, as though trying to stretch the taste of food across more time. People who had once spoken easily now kept their mouths closed, partly from tension, partly from the ache in their stomachs. Hunger reshaped posture, tone, and movement. Bodies began to fold inward, curling protectively around themselves. By the fourth or fifth day, the shortages grew visible. Bread rations shrank again. Meat became an occasional rumour. Even broth tasted thin, almost hollow. The kitchens, once noisy with clattering pots and rising steam, now worked in near silence. Fires burned low to save wood. Cooked meals were carried carefully, not because they were hot, but because they were precious. Each bowl mattered. The well-fed days before the siege felt distant, almost unreal. People spoke of meals they once had, as though recalling a story from childhood. Someone remembered the taste of honey. Someone else talked about roasted fowl at a festival. These memories made the present sharper, colder. Even the act of remembering seemed painful, as if nostalgia itself required energy they could no longer spare. In the storerooms, guards stood watch not against outside threats, but against those within. No one said this aloud, yet everyone understood the reason. Hunger softened morals. Desperation made thieves out of people who had never before taken anything that was not theirs. The presence of guards was a warning. The supplies were not only scarce, but they were also vulnerable. When the first fight broke out near the grain storage, it lasted only a few seconds. Two men reached for the same sack, both claiming they had been assigned to move it. The argument turned physical almost instantly. Their shouts echoed through the lower hall, drawing others who were equally hungry, equally tense. By the time soldiers intervened, the sack had split open, spilling grain across the floor like tiny fragments of gold. People watched the grains scatter, each one a reminder of what they had lost in that moment. As hunger deepened, conversations changed. People began speaking in shorter sentences. Their eyes drifted toward plates, bags, and cupboards. Children cried more easily. Adults snapped at each other with quiet urgency. There were moments when the entire courtyard went silent, as if everyone had paused to listen to the weight of their own emptiness. The most haunting part was how quickly starvation reshaped the castle's atmosphere. Gates, towers, and battlements still stood solid and imposing. From the outside, the fortress looked as strong as ever, a symbol of medieval resilience. But from within, the stone walls felt like husks, impressive to look at, useless for feeding a single person. The walls could protect them from swords, but not from the slow erosion of their own bodies. The enemy outside did not need to attack. They simply waited. Time was their weapon. Every day, without supply, the invisible nooses around the residence. Every morning, the castle woke a little weaker. Every evening, the fear of tomorrow grew heavier. People began making small calculations. How many days could they last? How much food remained? Who would fall ill first? These questions lingered beneath every action, shaping even the simplest gestures. A woman tearing bread into equal pieces trembled slightly, knowing that fairness could not stretch hunger into satisfaction. A man who once fed stray dogs near the gate now walked past them without looking, silently apologizing for instincts he could no longer afford. Starvation did not arrive with drama. It arrived with slow hands, quiet steps, and an unshakable patience. And once it entered the castle, it refused to leave. The castle's strength faltered long before the walls showed any cracks. Hunger seeped through every chamber, reshaping the lives within it. Within that creeping weakness, the true unraveling of the fortress began to take form. The well at the center of the courtyard had once been a symbol of reassurance. Its stone lip was worn smooth by the hands of generations, and the sound of its bucket rising had always brought a quiet comfort. But during the siege, the well changed from a place of life into a point of silent dread. People gathered around it each morning, not with ease, but with caution, unsure of what the next pull of the rope would bring. Water had become more valuable than any weapon in the fortress, yet it was also the first thing to betray them. Rumors spread quickly about the enemy tampering with the underground channels feeding the well. Soldiers along the ramparts swore they saw shadows moving near the outer springs before the siege line fully closed. Others whispered that the attackers had thrown dead animals into the streams or poured foul mixtures into the watercourses. There was no way to confirm any of it. But fear rarely waited for proof. When the water tasted slightly different one morning, sharper, metallic, strangely bitter, panic began to take shape. Quiet, but unmistakable. As the days passed, the condition of the water worsened. What had once been clear now carried flecks of sediment. Buckets surfaced with dark streaks along their edges. The smell changed too, shifting from the clean earthiness of deep stone water to something murky and stagnant. The well had become a mirror of the castle's deterioration, revealing every hidden flaw with each painful draw. People hesitated before drinking, yet hesitation did not quench thirst. Those who tried to boil the water found little comfort. Heating removed some impurities, but not the growing sense that the water itself had turned hostile. Children who drank too quickly became sick within hours. Their stomachs cramped violently, and their skin grew clammy with fever. Adults suffered the same fate. Vomiting, dizziness, and sudden weakness that left them collapsed in corners, unable to rise. The healer, already overwhelmed by hunger-related illness, recognized the signs but lacked the tools to fight them. To make matters worse, the stagnant pools within the castle grounds began to fill with runoff from crowded living areas. Waste seeped into cracks and collected in low spaces. Flies gathered. The smell of rot lingered in the air, mixing with the smoke from low-burning fires. Without fresh water to clean wounds, clothes, or cooking tools, the contamination spread easily. The fortress that once felt orderly now resembled a place unraveling faster than anyone could control. People approached the well with increasing fear. Some held their breath as they peered into its depths, imagining the water below as a trapped darkness waiting to consume them. Others dipped cups only halfway, hoping less contact would lessen the risk. But no matter how carefully they tried to ration or purify it, the truth remained unchanged. The well had turned against them. It no longer offered survival, but threatened to hasten their decline. Small disputes broke out around the water. A woman accused her neighbor of taking more than his fair share. A soldier scolded a child for dropping a cup, as if the spilled water had been a priceless treasure. People's tempers thinned even as their bodies weakened. The castle's once familiar routines were replaced by careful, anxious movements, each shaped by the fear that the next sip might bring sickness. The soldiers attempted to search for alternative water sources within the walls. Old cisterns, rain barrels, and hidden channels. But everything they found was either empty or fouled. The castle had never been designed to survive without its well-functioning. No fortress could last long without water. And everyone inside understood this, even if they tried not to say it aloud. In the early mornings, when the courtyard was still and the sun had barely touched the towers, people stood silently around the well, listening to the creaking rope. The sound was fragile, strained, as though the well itself resented the demand placed upon it. The bucket would rise slowly, dripping the sour, murky water that had become their only option. Faces would fall, expressions tightening with resignation. No one dared to voice what they truly feared, that the well was killing them faster than starvation. Illness spread through the castle like smoke slipping under doors. Those who fell sick were moved into crowded corners of the great hall, where the air grew thick with the scent of sweat and damp cloth. The healer's hands shook as she tried to care for them, her whispered reassurances sounding thinner each day. People who had once stood tall now struggled to remain upright. Every cough sounded heavier. Every breath seemed more fragile. Some residents avoided the well altogether, hoping to survive on whatever moisture they could find in their food. But with rations shrinking to almost nothing, this strategy failed quickly. Dehydration left them faint, confused, and trembling. In the end, most returned to the well, accepting the poisoned water as their only hope, even as they felt it carving illness through their bodies. The enemy outside did not need to strike the walls. They only had to wait. The siege was a test of endurance, and the castle's greatest weakness had revealed itself with cruel clarity. Water, the source of life, had become the silent cause of death. The poisoned, well-drained strength from the fortress faster than any army could. Each cup carried both relief and dread, binding survival to suffering. Beneath that uneasy choice, the deeper collapse of the castle began its quiet advance. Stench began to rise from the castle's latrines long before anyone understood what it meant. These small, crude spaces had always been unpleasant, but during the siege, they transformed into something far more dangerous than their builders had ever imagined. Designed for the slow rhythm of ordinary life, they were never meant to carry the burden of a crowded fortress sealed under pressure. Waste collected faster than it could be managed, and without a proper system to move or treat it. Every corner of the structure felt its spreading influence. At first, people tried to dismiss the odor drifting from the lower chambers. They hurried in and out, covering their faces, believing the discomfort would pass as it always had. But the air changed in ways no one could ignore. A thick, sour heaviness spread through the corridors, clinging to clothing and lingering on breath. It settled between stone walls, mixing with smoke from low-burning fires, creating an atmosphere that felt suffocating even in open courtyards. As days went by, the waste pits overflowed. Liquid seeped into cracks in the floor, darkening the stone with stains that never fully dried. Flies gathered in dense black clouds, their constant movement creating a faint buzzing that seemed to vibrate through the halls. Rats grew bolder, scurrying near sleeping places, feeding on whatever they found. People swatted at insects, stepped over puddles, and tried to pretend these changes were temporary. But nothing about the siege was temporary anymore. Stagnation carried consequences quickly. Illness emerged in subtle ways. A stomach cramp here, a bout of diarrhea there. Symptoms people blamed on hunger or spoiled food. Yet the pattern spread with unsettling speed. Children doubled over in pain. Adults grew pale and weak, their breaths shallow, their steps unsteady. The healer recognized what was happening, though she lacked the tools to stop it. Contaminated air, contaminated waste, contaminated hands. Everything touched everything, and nothing stayed clean long enough to matter. The smell thickened, crawling through sleeping chambers, weaving into blankets and clothing. People washed when they could, but water itself was scarce and sometimes unsafe. Even the act of cleaning carried risk. Buckets filled with foul water sloshed and spilled. Cloths used for washing spread contamination from room to room. Each attempt to manage the growing crisis only seemed to deepen it. Fear reshaped behavior faster than sickness did. People avoided the lower chambers, choosing to wait in discomfort rather than face the latrines. Lines grew longer, tempers shorter. Accusations were whispered. Someone had not cleaned properly. Someone else had let waste spill. Someone else had used too much water. Tension tightened like a rope around the residents, drawn with each new day of confinement. In sheltered corners of the castle, voices trembled as they spoke about symptoms they did not want to admit. A single stomach pain could be dismissed, but when it returned, sharper and deeper, dread followed. People whispered stories of individuals who had fallen ill one morning and died by nightfall, their bodies too weak to fight the infection that had slipped into their system. Mothers held their children close, watching for any sign of discomfort. Fathers tried to stay calm, though hunger and fear made their hands shake. Attempts to control the filth failed. Soldiers assigned to clean the waste pits found themselves gagging, dizzy, and unable to finish their tasks. Some refused to return, their fear outweighing orders. Others worked until they collapsed, overcome by fumes and exhaustion. The overflowing pits became symbols of the siege's true power, not in the strength of the enemy outside, but in the weakness growing within. People began to understand that the fortress was turning against them. Walls could block arrows, but not disease. Gates could stop soldiers, but not contamination carried by air, insects, and human touch. The structure they trusted was slowly poisoning them, trapping them in a cycle of filth and illness with no escape. By night, the latrine chambers felt almost alive. Shadows shifted as rats moved across the stone. The dripping of waste echoed faintly, like a heartbeat buried beneath the castle. Those who walked near the area quickened their pace, avoiding the darkness that trapped the smell inside. Even the guards stationed nearby avoided eye contact with one another, each silently aware of what they were guarding, not safety, but decay. As the sickness spread, the healer moved through the halls with a tired determination. Her supplies were nearly gone. Clean water was scarce. Every patient she touched represented another step toward a sickness she could not avoid. Yet she continued, her quiet presence a small act of resistance against a force that felt inevitable. She saw the truth in every fever, every cramp, every cry of pain. The latrines had become the center of the castle's suffering. Death arrived quietly for many. A man fell asleep and never woke. A child's cries weakened until they faded entirely. A woman collapsed while trying to fetch water, her body unable to fight the infection that had ravaged her from within. People mourned in silence, too afraid to speak the full extent of what they feared, that this was only the beginning. Nothing the enemy did outside the walls was as devastating as what was happening inside. The siege had not broken the castle by force. It had simply waited for the fortress to poison itself. Contamination spread through the fortress with a quiet persistence stronger than any invading force. Every breath carried a reminder that the walls no longer protected those trapped within them. In that deepening foulness, the path toward greater suffering began to take shape. Diseases began to spread through the castle with a quiet determination that frightened even the strongest among its residents. At first, the signs were subtle: a few cases of fever, a handful of people complaining of sharp stomach pain, a soldier coughing in the early hours of dawn. But within days, symptoms grew more violent, more insistent. The cramped chambers, the stale air, and the weakened bodies offered perfect ground for illness to take hold. What had begun as scattered discomfort quickly formed into a tide the castle could not resist. Plague-like swellings appeared on the necks and underarms of several residents. Their skin flushed and hot to the touch. Dysentery swept through shared sleeping areas, forcing people to lie curled in pain, their strength draining with every hour. Typhoid crept into the population with its unmistakable fever, a heat that burned from within until the eyes grew dull and the voice weakened to a whisper. No one knew which illness was the first to breach the castle's defences, but together they moved like a single force, consuming everything in their path. The healer worked tirelessly, though each day revealed the limits of her knowledge and supplies. She possessed no medicines capable of stopping the infections from spreading through the fortress. Dried herbs, meant to soothe pain, were nearly gone. Cloth, used for bandages, had been washed so many times that it tore at the slightest pull. She moved among the sick with quiet determination, her hands trembling not from fear of illness, but from the helplessness that settled deeper with each life she could not save. Her face grew pale, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion and grief. Word of the spreading diseases travelled faster than the infections themselves. People began avoiding the infirmary, terrified of what they might witness inside, rows of bodies curled in fever, shoulders shuddering, hands clutching at blankets as if trying to hold on to the last warmth they had. The smell of sickness drifted into the hallway. Sour, heavy, unmistakable. No one could ignore it. It clung to every breath. As more people fell ill, fear reshaped the castle's daily rhythm. Those who could still walk kept to themselves, avoiding touch, avoiding shared tools, and avoiding enclosed spaces whenever possible. Families who had lived closely for years now slept apart, each person clutching their thin blanket as though it could serve as a shield. Mothers watched their children with haunted eyes, knowing that one cough might mean the beginning of a decline they could neither prevent nor understand. In time, some of the sick were moved to isolated corners of the fortress. These were not proper quarantine spaces. They were storage rooms, half-collapsed chambers, and unused corridors where the air felt colder and the silence more pronounced. People left food and water near the door without entering. The isolation was meant to protect the healthy, but it felt more like abandonment. Those lying inside called weakly for help. Few answered. The most terrifying cases were those who grew delirious in their fever. Their voices rose unexpectedly in the night, muttering incoherent phrases or crying out for family members who could not approach. Their suffering echoed through the stone halls, reminding everyone that illness did not merely kill. It unmade people long before death arrived. As infection intensified, whispers began circulating about measures taken in other sieges. In other times, tales of bodies burned to stop contamination from spreading. Stories of sick rooms set ablaze, not out of cruelty, but desperation. In the castle, these whispers grew louder when several isolated patients died within days of one another. The smell from their chamber began to drift through the cracks of the door, thick and unmistakable. People argued in hushed tones about what should be done. No one wanted to take action. Yet no one could bear the thought of letting the disease move freely through the remaining population. At last, a difficult decision was made. The dead were carried out on wooden boards by soldiers who had wrapped themselves in damp cloth to avoid breathing too deeply. The bodies were taken to a clearing inside the walls, where a pyre was built from precious firewood, normally reserved for winter nights. Flames rose slowly at first, then consumed the bodies with a harsh, dry crackle. People watched from a distance, their faces drawn tight with fear and sorrow. The fire marked a shift in the siege, not in the external conflict, but in the internal unravelling of the community trapped behind the walls. The enemy beyond the fortress did nothing to cause this suffering. They simply waited while illness worked on their behalf. No sword, no arrow, no siege engine could have inflicted as much damage as the invisible forces moving through the castle's dim corridors. The spread of disease weakened the fortress more deeply than any assault could achieve. Every cough and fever carried a reminder that survival was slipping out of reach. Within that growing vulnerability, the fortress faced a new terror that no wall was built to withstand. People began moving into the lower chambers when the first volleys of stones and flaming arrows struck the outer walls. The sound of impact echoed through every corner of the fortress, pushing families downward into the only spaces that seemed safe from the falling debris. Stairways filled with hurried footsteps, and the air grew warmer, thicker, harder to breathe as bodies crowded into passages that had been designed for storage, not survival. The deeper they went, the more the light faded, until the world above felt distant and unreal. The underground rooms were small and uneven, carved from stone that held the chill of forgotten winters. Mothers carried infants close to their chests, whispering reassurances they barely believed. Children pressed their hands over their ears to block out the thunder of the siege above. Men tried to appear steady, but even they felt the weight of the darkness pressing in. Each room became a confined pocket of fear, a place where every breath seemed to use up the remaining air. At first, people tried to organize themselves. They arranged sleeping areas, tried to leave pathways clear, and attempted to keep lamps lit. But the lamps burned oil too quickly, and soon the light shrank to scattered flickers that barely illuminated the ground. Without enough oxygen, the flames sputtered and died, leaving the rooms in near-total darkness. Voices became the only reliable guide, though even those grew faint as exhaustion settled over the shelter. The air changed long before anyone commented on it. Moisture from breathing bodies condensed on the walls, creating a slickness that made the stone feel alive. The scent of sweat, damp cloth, and unwashed skin merged into a single heavy odor that clung to everything. People lay on the ground to conserve energy, but the stone floor drained heat from their bodies, leaving them shivering. Those who sat upright often grew dizzy from the lack of fresh air. No draft reached these depths, and each exhale replaced what little comfort remained with something more stale. Panic grew quietly at first. A child cried in the darkness and could not be soothed. A woman gasped for air, her breathing sharp and rapid. A man shouted for space, insisting he could not breathe, even though others were pressed as tightly as he was. The darkness amplified every sound, turning whispers into threats, turning movements into warnings. In the absence of light, imagination filled every void, shaping fear into something tangible. As hours stretched into days, the shelter lost any sense of order. People argued over space, over air, over silence. Some curled into corners, trembling. Others paced along the walls, feeling for cracks in the stone as though they might find a hidden way out. Children clung to their parents with fingers that trembled from exhaustion and terror. The darkness did not protect them. It swallowed them whole, leaving them unsure of where the walls ended and where their own fear began. A few attempted to climb back toward the upper levels, desperate for even a trace of fresh air. But the sound of siege engines and shattering stone drove them downward again. The castle above no longer felt like a refuge. The shelter below felt like a tomb being filled in slow. Deliberate layers. Each breath tasted of despair. Each moment felt suspended between survival and surrender. Some began to lose their sense of time. Without sunlight or the rhythm of daily life, the hours blended. People woke, unsure if they had slept. They asked questions without expecting answers. How long had it been? Was the enemy still attacking? Would they ever see the sky again? The silence that followed these questions was more painful than any reply could have been. Eventually, the darkness changed people. The lack of air made their minds blur. The lack of light made their thoughts twist. A few muttered to themselves, repeating words that no one understood. Some cried quietly into their hands. Others grew restless, pacing in small circles as if trying to outrun their own fear. The shelter had become a breeding ground for panic. and panic spread like a disease. Invisible, contagious, impossible to contain. The most frightening moments came when someone snapped. A man shouted at shadows, convinced someone had stolen food he did not have. A woman struck the wall repeatedly, screaming for the door to be opened. Children screamed when they felt hands brush past them in the dark, unsure whether those hands belonged to friends or strangers. The darkness robbed everyone of certainty, leaving them suspended between instinct and madness. Occasionally, someone attempted to light a lamp, but the flame flickered weakly and died as soon as it tasted the suffocating air. The darkness returned each time, deeper and more absolute. The shelter felt less like a protective space and more like a living thing, feeding on the residents' fear, drawing strength from their weakness. Above them, stones continued to fall. Yet nothing outside the walls terrified them as much as what they had become in the darkness beneath the castle. Survival no longer depended on weapons or courage. It depended on their ability to survive themselves. The shelter tore away the last remnants of calm that had survived the early days of the siege. Darkness pressed into their minds until fear replaced reason. Inside that suffocating gloom, the fortress drifted closer to a ruin that had nothing to do with the enemy outside. Fires inside the castle had once been ordinary, a part of daily life. The kitchens produced meals for the residents, heating great iron pots and burning through piles of wood each day. No one questioned the constant presence of flames, because warmth and food depended on them. But during the siege, when water became scarce and bodies grew weak, those same flames took on a different meaning. They became quiet threats waiting for a mistake, a gust of wind, or a moment of distraction. The kitchens remained crowded long after hunger had begun to spread. As people waited for even the smallest portion of warm food, exhausted cooks moved through the smoky air with lowered heads, their hands trembling as they tended to fires that burned less brightly each day. The wood they used was damp or rotten, sending sparks outward in unpredictable bursts. The hearths, built for stability, now crackled with unstable flames that curled along the edges of pots and licked at the wooden beams overhead. It happened slowly at first. A single ember drifted from a poorly tended stove. A cook brushed it aside with a cloth too dry to withstand the heat. Another ember landed on a stack of straw brought in to keep the floor warm. The straw glowed faintly, unnoticed. The air was thick with smoke and fatigue, and no one had the strength or clarity to see how close the danger had come. When the fire finally caught, it happened in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable. A burst of flame rose along the side of a pot, crawling upward toward a hanging cloth. People screamed and backed away, tripping over each other in the narrow space. The cloth ignited instantly, sending a wave of heat across the room. The cooks tried to smother it, but the force of the fire pushed them back. Their hands were bare, their bodies weakened, and the room around them had become a chamber of dry fuel. Under normal circumstances, the residents might have formed a bucket chain, drawing water from the well and passing it hand to hand. But there was not enough water to spare. Every drop had been rationed for drinking, cleaning wounds, or cooling fevers. When someone shouted for water, others hesitated, torn between the instinct to fight the fire and the fear of wasting what they needed to stay alive. Moments passed, too many moments, and the fire grew larger, louder, brighter. The flames spread with a kind of cruel grace. They moved across the rafters, down the walls, and through the small cracks where straw, cloth, or dried wood had been tucked away for warmth. Smoke filled the corridor, rolling outward in a thick, suffocating wave. People fled blindly, coughing and crying, stumbling over benches and fallen stones. The heat pressed against their skin like a living force, pushing them toward the few exits still open. Some did not escape, The smoke overwhelmed them before they reached the doorway. Their bodies collapsed to the floor, where flames slid eagerly toward them. Others reached the courtyard only to collapse on the ground, gasping for air that tasted of burning stone. Panic spread faster than the fire itself. Moving through the fortress in frantic whispers, the kitchens are burning. The corridors are filled with smoke. The fire is moving upward, without water and without a trained force to fight the growing blaze. The castle had no defense. Soldiers tried beating the flames with cloth, but the cloth caught fire. Others swung shields or boards of wood, desperately pushing the flames away from sleeping chambers, storerooms, and the narrow stairwells leading to the lower levels. But each effort only stirred the air, feeding oxygen to the blaze. The fire grew stronger, fed by fear and desperation. Flames reached rooms where people had hidden from the siege. They found families huddled together, their faces pale with exhaustion. Smoke poured through cracks beneath doors, filling the air with a choking thickness that turned breath into agony. Some attempted to shield their children with their bodies, but there was little they could do. The fire consumed everything without hesitation, indifferent to sorrow or pleading. Outside, the enemy watched the smoke rising from within the walls. They did not need to launch another attack. The fortress was burning itself from the inside, weakened not by their weapons but by the simple, devastating truth that survival required fire, and fire demanded control no one could offer anymore. When the flames finally weakened, the damage was unmistakable. Rooms once used for meals were now blackened shells. Storage spaces filled with supplies had been reduced to piles of ash. Bodies lay where the smoke had caught them, their silhouettes marked by soot and silence. The castle remained standing, but the people inside had been cut deeply by a disaster born not from siege engines, but from the struggle to stay warm and fed. Flames exposed the castle's fragility more clearly than any enemy assault. Smoke wound through its chambers until every breath carried the memory of danger. Within that lingering haze, the fortress edged closer to a downfall shaped by its own desperate needs. The castle still looked strong from afar. Its walls rose sharply against the sky. Each stone fitted tightly into the next, forming a barrier that had withstood storms, raids, and years of quiet decay. The gates remained closed, reinforced with iron bars and thick planks. To anyone watching from beyond the siege lines, the fortress appeared unbroken, as though its defenders were ready for whatever might come. But inside, the truth had drifted far from the image that stone and timber projected. The people within those walls no longer carried the strength that had once defined their resolve. Exhaustion had seeped into their bones. Weeks of hunger, fear, smoke, and sickness had reshaped their bodies and their minds until they no longer felt like the defenders of anything. Their movements grew slow, their thoughts dulled by the weight pressing against them from every direction. The walls stood firm, but those who depended on them no longer had the energy to stand with equal determination. Smoke still clung to the corridors after the recent fires. Its scent lingered in fabric, in hair, in the cracks between stones. Even the smallest spark or ember caused hearts to race, as though the memory of the flames refused to loosen its hold. People avoided halls that reminded them of the blaze, stepping instead through side passages, stairwells, and narrow chambers where they felt slightly safer, though not truly safe. Every room carried its own form of danger, its own reminder that the siege had turned their home into an unstable labyrinth. Some residents had stopped trying to sleep. They lay awake on straw mats or bare stone floors, listening to the breathing of those around them, trying to guess which cough signaled sickness or which shuffle of feet belonged to someone too weak to stand. Soldiers, once the backbone of the castle's defense, sat slumped in corners with their eyes half closed, fingers loose around their weapons. They no longer inspected their armor or sharpened their blades. The effort required more strength than they possessed. In the great hall, once a place of gatherings and meals, people now sat in scattered groups, leaning against the cold walls. Their hunger shaped their faces, leaving sharp lines where softness had once been. Their eyes drifted without focus, as though they were looking at something just beyond sight. A memory, a hope, a question they no longer had the words to ask. Conversations faded quickly. No one had the energy to speak for long. A few tried to keep order. They walked the corridors, checking on the sick, the wounded, and the frightened. But even their calm voices trembled with fatigue. They knew that the defenses no longer depended on strategy or courage. They depended on whether the remaining residents could endure another day without collapsing. The truth settled heavily on them. Walls could stop arrows, but they could not stop despair. Outside, the enemy watched for signs of weakness. They saw fewer figures moving on the ramparts. They heard less activity behind the stone barrier. From time to time, a messenger returned to their camp, reporting that the gates remained shut. But the battlements seemed emptier. The enemy did not need to rush. Time itself was working in their favor, hollowing the castle from within. Inside the fortress, supplies neared their end. Water was rationed drop by drop. Food had become little more than scraps and memory. Those who tried to work, to guard, to cook, or to tend the sick found their limbs shaking, their heads spinning. More than once, a defender fainted at their post, sliding down the wall with a quiet thud. No one shouted in alarm. No one had the strength. Moments of silence grew longer. People began to listen for footsteps that never came, for orders that were no longer given, for hope that had retreated into shadow. The castle had not yet been breached, but the sense of collapse hung in the air like dust stirred from forgotten corners. Some residents whispered that the siege would end not when the enemy forced the gates open, but when those inside could no longer stand to resist. A terrible thought began to form among the more exhausted defenders. The walls were no longer protecting them. They were trapping them. Each day spent behind the stone gates diminished their ability to fight, to think, to survive. What had once been a sanctuary now felt like a slow and deliberate confinement, sealing their fate with every passing hour. There were places in the castle where no one ventured anymore. Rooms filled with bodies, chambers where the sick had been isolated, corridors where smoke still hovered faintly, refusing to disappear entirely. These spaces served as silent reminders that the enemy did not need to lift a finger. The castle was unraveling from its own weight, from the crushing demands of survival that no one could meet. When defenders gathered near the gate to discuss their next move, their voices were thin, strained. Some argued to hold out longer, insisting that strength might return, that supplies might last. Others stared blankly ahead, their expressions empty. They understood the truth, even if they could not speak it. A fortress with starving, sick, and broken defenders could not endure. Strength was not in the walls, it was in the people. And the people were disappearing. The fortress's decline deepened long before the enemy stepped inside. Every exhausted breath revealed how little strength remained within its walls. Through that quiet unraveling, the castle edged toward a downfall no stone barrier could delay. Hunger reshaped the castle long before anyone spoke of the unthinkable. It hollowed faces, sharpened bones, and weakened every step, until even lifting a hand felt like a task too heavy to bear. People who once worked in the kitchens, storerooms, and guard posts moved with a slow, uneven rhythm, their bodies no longer able to obey their intentions. At first, the residents tried to stretch their remaining supplies with careful discipline. Meals became thin mixtures of water and crumbs. Later, even those crumbs vanished. When the last pieces of bread were gone, people turned to anything that might offer nourishment. Leather from belts was boiled until it softened into a bitter paste. Moss scraped from the walls was chewed in silence, its taste harsh and metallic. Bones from previous meals were crushed and boiled again, producing a thin broth that carried more memory than substance. Each attempt at survival grew more desperate, and each day seemed heavier than the one before it. The first body found in one of the inner chambers did not immediately raise suspicion. A man had died overnight, weakened by fever and starvation. His family mourned him quietly, wrapping him in a worn blanket. But by morning, the body had been moved. Some said they heard footsteps. Others said they heard nothing at all. Only when the blanket was found discarded behind a stairwell did understanding settle over the castle like a cold wind. By then, it was too late to pretend it had not happened. Whispers drifted through the corridors, each one slower and softer than the last. People avoided looking at one another, aware that some among them had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Hunger had consumed the castle's dignity, its restraint, and its sense of community. Now, it began consuming the dead. As days passed, bodies were no longer left untouched. Those who died in the night were taken away before dawn, their absence explained with vague gestures or short apologies. The truth remained unspoken, though no one needed words to understand it. Desperation had grown into a force stronger than morality, stronger than fear, stronger even than the shame that once guided their actions. In the darker corners of the fortress, where the flicker of torchlight rarely reached, people gathered around what little they could find. They worked quietly, their hands trembling not only from weakness, but from the knowledge of what they were doing. Some refused to look directly at the remains. Others stared with hollow eyes, as though detaching themselves from the moment might lessen the weight of their actions. No one spoke. Silence made the act easier to bear. There were rumors that the dead were not the only ones taken. Stories drifted through the shelter rooms, a child gone missing, a prisoner who had not been seen for days, a woman who vanished after collapsing from exhaustion. Some people dismissed these whispers as fear twisting itself into something larger. Others believed them completely. Neither group slept peacefully. The castle's leaders tried to intervene, but their strength had faded as much as everyone else's. They attempted to organize watch groups, to protect the vulnerable, to maintain some fragile sense of order, but enforcement required energy and authority, neither of which remained. The siege had drained them of everything except the hope that the end might arrive before the last thread of humanity snapped. Nothing in the castle felt familiar anymore. Corridors that once echoed with daily routines now felt haunted. People avoided crossing paths, afraid of what hunger might drive another person to do. Families kept children close, holding them even while sleeping. Every sound in the night carried a new meaning. Every shadow suggested danger. Survival no longer felt like a shared effort. It had become something solitary, guarded, and quiet. Outside, the enemy did not know the extent of what was happening within the walls. They saw fewer figures on the battlements. I've heard fewer voices carried by the wind. To them, the castle was simply weakening. They could not imagine how far the residents had already fallen. The siege had pushed them beyond any measure of suffering they had once believed possible. Inside, guilt settled heavily over those who had participated in the unthinkable. Some looked at their hands as though they belonged to someone else. Others avoided looking at all, staring into the floor or the darkness where no reflections could emerge. Shame had become another form of hunger, consuming whatever dignity remained. Yet the choice had never been simple. It had been shaped by fear, necessity, and the crushing reality of a world sealed behind stone walls. The boundaries that once guided their actions had dissolved. What remained was the brutal logic of survival in a place where all other options had been stripped away. The residents crossed a threshold that starvation had carved into their minds long before the act occurred. Every quiet choice revealed how deeply the siege had reshaped their sense of right and wrong. Within that grim descent, The fortress moved toward a darkness far heavier than anything outside its walls. Food supplies had become symbols of survival, long before anyone realized they were changing. The remaining sacks of grain, bundles of dried herbs, and barrels of salted meat were guarded with quiet vigilance. People checked them each morning, hoping to see exactly what they had seen the day before. No less, no more. But as the siege lengthened, hope began slipping away from those storerooms. Something had shifted in the air, and people felt it long before they understood it. At first, the signs seemed mild. A faint odour near one of the lower storage rooms. A patch of discoloration along the wooden lid of a barrel. A strange buzzing echoed through the darkest corners of the storerooms. Residents dismissed these small details, telling themselves exhaustion had sharpened their senses too much. They wanted to believe their food remained untouched, because the alternative was unbearable. Soon, the truth revealed itself. The enemy had begun tossing corpses near the outer wells and storage areas, letting decay drift toward the food supply. They had done it quietly, knowing the wind would carry the smell through cracks in the stone, knowing insects would follow the scent, knowing rot spread faster in a fortress already weakened by fear. Some of the bodies were animals, others were not, and over time, the contamination found its way inward. Inside the storerooms, shadows shifted in unnatural ways. Rats darted through broken sacks of grain, their teeth sharp and relentless. Their presence alone was troubling. But the marks they left behind carried even more danger. Excrement, gnawed seeds, trails through flour that revealed movement at night. Some residents placed traps, but more rats arrived each day, drawn by hunger and the lack of barriers that once kept them out. No one had the strength to construct new defences. There were rumours of sabotage as well. A guard reported seeing a figure near the storerooms after dusk. Someone from inside the castle. The guard tried to follow, but his weakened body slowed him, and the figure vanished into the maze of corridors. The next morning, a barrel of salted fish had been tampered with. Another day, a sack of oats was found soaked with foul-smelling liquid. People whispered about betrayal, though no one dared accuse anyone directly. Trust was too fragile to survive another fracture. When food began making people sick, the change was swift and unforgiving. A group of soldiers ate from a pot of stew one evening, and by sunrise, half of them could not stand. Their stomachs twisted violently. Their skin grew cold and damp. Their breathing turned shallow and irregular. Some cried out in pain, clutching their chests or stomachs with trembling hands. Others curled into themselves, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. The residents searched for explanations. Some blamed the water. Others thought the stew had been left out too long. But when more people fell ill after eating different meals, panic began to spread. Every bite became a test of courage. Every swallow carried uncertainty. No one could trust the food they had left. Yet they had no choice but to keep eating. The smell inside the storerooms worsened with each passing day. Rot spread like a slow, suffocating fog. Grain that once smelled earthy and warm now carried the bitterness of mould. Dried meat, once a comfort, showed signs of discoloration and soft patches where insects had fed. Even vegetables stored in cool chambers began to collapse inward, leaving behind wet impressions on the stone floor. Some people tried to pick through the supplies carefully, removing anything that looked suspicious. Others chose to eat less, hoping to stretch the remaining clean food. But hunger did not allow moderation. It pushed the residents toward decisions they might never have considered under different circumstances. They ate what they could find, trusting their instincts more than their eyes, because instinct was the only tool they had left. The enemy outside did not need to break the walls. They had already achieved what they wanted. The castle's defences were failing not from force, but from poison and decay that seeped into every corner. Food, the very thing meant to sustain life, had become a silent threat shaping every hour. As more people died from contamination, the atmosphere inside the fortress shifted again. People walked with hesitation, as though stepping through invisible dangers. Storage rooms that once represented safety now felt like chambers of uncertainty. The residents had begun to measure their remaining days, not by strength or morale, but by what remained edible, and even that measure no longer felt reliable. What had once been a battle of weapons had turned into a battle of endurance against unseen forces hiding in sacks, barrels, and shadows. The poisoned stores revealed how deeply the castle's lifelines had been compromised. Every meal became a risk that eroded whatever hope remained. Amid that creeping contamination, the fortress moved closer to a collapse, shaped by forces no wall could keep out. Suspicion entered the castle long before anyone dared to name it. It drifted through the halls like a thin draft, subtle at first, then sharper as fear tightened its grip on the residents. People avoided eye contact, speaking in shorter sentences, and watching the slightest shift in behavior. Exhaustion had weakened their bodies, but distrust hollowed something deeper, the fragile sense of unity that had held them together during the siege's earliest days. The first incident whispered of betrayal came when someone found the outer gate slightly misaligned at dawn. It had not been opened fully, just enough to unsettle the guards and raise questions none of them wanted to confront. They searched the perimeter for footprints, but the night's wind and shifting dust erased all evidence. Some insisted the wind had moved the gate. Others insisted wind could not lift iron. Before long, more unsettling signs appeared. A storage room that had been secured the evening before was discovered open, with its contents disturbed. Not stolen. Disturbed, as though someone had searched for something specific. A torch left smouldering near bales of straw was found by a young guard during his rounds. He stamped it out with trembling hands, knowing that a few more minutes of neglect would have turned the room into a blaze. Stranger still were the movements of certain individuals who avoided crowded areas, slipping instead through back corridors or emerging from stairwells. No one remembered hearing footsteps in. They answered questions quickly, too quickly, offering explanations that soothed nothing. People watched them walk away and felt unease settle in their stomachs like a heavy stone. One night, a soldier claimed he saw a figure near the inner gate. Fumbling with the locking mechanisms, he shouted, but his weak voice barely carried in the darkness. The figure fled into the shadows before he could give chase. In the dim torchlight, all he could describe was a cloak, a hand, and the faint impression of someone who knew exactly where to step to avoid being caught. These small incidents carved fractures through the community. People began sleeping with their backs against walls, clutching makeshift weapons. Parents kept their children closer than ever. A few residents formed quiet watch groups, though they could hardly trust one another fully. Every whisper sounded sharper. Every footstep in an empty corridor made hearts race. As the siege dragged on, desperation reshaped loyalty. Some believed that opening the gates, even for only a moment, might offer a chance to escape. Others believed surrender would at least save those still alive. These thoughts, once unspeakable, now moved in the minds of people who had lost too much: food, strength, relatives, I hope. And those thoughts, once they took root, made betrayal seem less like a crime and more like a survival instinct. One morning, smoke rose from the grain storage. Someone had set fire to the smallest section of the reserves. The flames were contained before they spread, but the damage was enough to strip away any remaining illusions of safety. Someone inside the walls had acted intentionally. Someone had decided that the castle did not deserve to hold what little hope remained. Fear of an infiltrator tightened its grip. People whispered the word spy, but the term felt foreign, almost unreal. A spy suggested someone working for the enemy with purpose and clarity. What frightened the residents more was the possibility that betrayal came from someone they knew, someone sharing their desperation, someone who had eaten from the same pot and slept beside the same walls. Trust collapsed faster than any physical structure could. The residents divided themselves unconsciously into small groups based on familiarity or instinct. Conversations quieted when others approached. Even kindness felt dangerous. A shared cup, a piece of cloth, a gesture. Any of it could be hiding a motive no one could afford to overlook. Guards trying to maintain order found themselves under suspicion as well. Their keys, their routes, and their moments alone were questioned. No one wanted to accuse them outright, but glances lasted too long, and silence carried too much weight. Authority had lost its meaning in a place where survival depended not on command, but on intuition sharpened by fear. Rumors multiplied. Some said a deal had been made with the enemy, a promise of safety in exchange for sabotage. Others believed someone inside had simply gone mad from hunger and sickness. A few whispered darker theories, that betrayal had begun even before the siege, that someone had planned this slow collapse long before the walls were sealed. No one knew the truth. Yet the truth hardly mattered anymore. The damage had been done, not just to the fortress, but to the fragile spirit of its people. They were no longer a community, but a collection of wary individuals, sharing the same crumbling stone and the same thinning air. The castle's unity fractured long before its walls showed any weakness. Every quiet suspicion drained whatever strength remained among those trapped inside. Within that growing distrust, the fortress moved toward an ending, shaped as much by fear as by the siege beyond. Punishment inside the castle began as a whisper, a quiet response to fear that had lingered for too long. People had already grown suspicious of one another, watching movements, counting footsteps, and memorizing who left a room and who returned. When the first accusation surfaced, it broke the fragile balance that had barely held the residents together. Hunger and sickness had weakened their judgment, but fear sharpened their impulses until they no longer trusted hesitation. The crowd gathered in the courtyard just after dawn, drawn by a rumor too powerful to ignore. A man stood in the center, his hands bound, his face pale from exhaustion and shock. Some claimed he had been seen near the storage rooms before the fire. Others insisted he had walked toward the gate at night. No one agreed on the details, but agreement was no longer necessary. The siege had stripped them of patience. Suspicion alone felt like enough. Voices rose around him, some trembling with anger, others hollow and tired. They demanded answers, though they did not wait for them. The accused man tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, drowned by the noise of those desperate to find someone responsible for their suffering. In a place with no relief, anger became a kind of fuel, and they clung to it. The guards, weakened like everyone else, stepped forward with heavy reluctance. They did not want to carry out the punishment, yet they feared what might happen if they refused. Authority had become thin, fragile, almost performative. To maintain any form of control, they felt compelled to act decisively. They tied the accused to a post near the courtyard wall and waited for the crowd to quiet. Interrogation was quick. The man repeated that he had done nothing wrong, that he had only gone to look for water during the night. His voice trembled not from guilt, but from fear. The crowd interpreted this trembling as a sign of deceit. They leaned closer, desperate for confession, hungry for certainty. Their desperation left no room for doubt. When he maintained his innocence, punishment began. There was no ritual, no formal judgment, only the slow, deliberate pain inflicted by those who believed they were protecting what remained of their fragile community. A silence settled over the courtyard as the first blows landed. No one looked away. Some watched with hardened expressions, others with a distant emptiness, as though witnessing something they already understood would haunt them. By the time the sun reached the top of the wall, the man no longer had the strength to cry out. His head hung forward, his breath shallow. The guards stepped back, and the crowd dispersed with the heavy steps of people who had not found the relief they expected. Punishment had not restored unity. It had only deepened the shadows around them. The next accusation came days later. A woman had been seen speaking to someone near a small window overlooking the outer field. No one knew who she had spoken to, but the idea alone ignited fear. She was dragged into the great hall, where torches burned weakly, and the air smelled of smoke and cold stone. People watched from the corners, clutching their thin blankets or the hands of their children. She insisted she had spoken to herself, praying under her breath for help. But her explanation, spoken softly, could not pierce the fear that had consumed the residents. They demanded a confession. She could not give them one. Punishment followed quickly, as though the need to act overshadowed any need for truth. Punishments became a grim rhythm inside the castle. Anyone who wandered too far alone, who hesitated when questioned, who seemed too quiet or too restless, any of them could be the next to face accusations. Even the weak, especially the weak, found themselves targeted. Their frailty made them convenient symbols of the fear others could not name. By hurting them, people believed they were defending themselves. Families hid their loved ones, keeping them out of sight to avoid suspicion. Children learned to stay silent, afraid that even a misplaced look might be interpreted as guilt. The castle, once a place meant to protect them from external enemies, now turned inward with brutal intensity. Rumors began to circulate that the enemy outside had stopped their assaults temporarily. Choosing instead to wait, they did not need to act. The residents were weakening themselves in ways no army could replicate. Punishment had become not just discipline, but a weapon people used against themselves, driven by fear, hunger, and the painful need for control. The walls still stood strong, but the people inside them no longer did. Their exhaustion shaped every accusation, every sentence, every act of cruelty. They had become both defenders and destroyers of their own sanctuary. The punishments revealed how deeply fear had settled into the fortress. Every accusation drew strength from panic rather than truth. Through this internal brutality, the castle edged nearer to a breaking point that no enemy strike could match. Siege weapons had always existed in stories told around the hearth. Tales of massive stones flung across fields, of walls trembling under blows delivered from impossible distances. Yet nothing in those stories prepared the residents for the reality that unfolded outside the castle walls. The enemy assembled their machines with methodical calm, as though constructing tools for harvest rather than destruction. Wooden frames rose first, stark silhouettes against a grey sky. Ropes were fitted, tightened, and tested. Counterweights were filled with stones. Each part slid into place with patient, deliberate purpose. The first shot came at dawn. A slow creaking filled the air, followed by a sudden release that echoed across the landscape. A stone shot upward, briefly catching the pale morning light before descending in a heavy arc that ended in a violent impact against the outer wall. Dust rose in a thick cloud. The defenders flinched, though the wall remained unbroken. It was only the beginning. Throughout the day, the assaults continued. Stones larger than a man's torso slammed into the same section of wall with persistent accuracy. Wooden beams cracked under the strain. Mortar flaked away. Each impact shook the rooms inside the castle, rattling doors and sending small objects tumbling from shelves. Children cried out. Adults covered their ears. No one grew used to the rhythm of destruction. The rotating crossbows were next. Their whirring sound carried across the battlefield before the bolts appeared. Thin, fast, and almost invisible until they struck. The bolts embedded themselves into wooden doors, shields, and even stone surfaces. They came in clusters, slicing through the air with mechanical precision. Defenders on the battlements crouched low, their hands trembling around their weapons. Looking over the wall felt like inviting death. Even standing behind parapets offered no guarantee of safety. The catapults followed a different pattern. They launched projectiles not meant to merely break stone, but to break the spirit. Dead animals, burning debris, clay pots filled with foul-smelling substances that shattered upon impact, releasing clouds of smoke that drifted into the castle's interior. The smell clung to everything, settling into clothing and hair, making breathing feel heavy and strained. The walls, once symbols of protection, no longer inspired confidence. Each new weapon struck them with a force that reminded everyone inside how temporary their safety truly was. The castle shook with every bombardment. Dust drifted from the ceilings. Small cracks widened. People began moving away from the outer rooms, choosing instead to sleep where the vibrations felt weaker. Even if those places offered little comfort, noise became its own form of assault. Day and night, the castle echoed with the groans of siege engines and the thunder of impact. Sleep grew scarce, even when exhaustion dragged someone into brief rest. They woke abruptly with the next strike. Heart pounding, breath unsteady. The noise did not simply interrupt life. It reshaped it. Conversations became short. Meals, when they occurred, were quiet and hurried. People scanned the walls constantly, waiting for signs of the next assault. Inside, craftsmen tried to reinforce weakened sections of the structure, but their materials were limited, and their strength was fading. They nailed wooden planks over cracked stone. They stuffed cloth into gaps to keep dust from choking those indoors. But each repair felt inadequate, undone within hours by another strike from the enemy's machines. Children clung to their parents' legs, asking questions no one could answer. Women covered infants' ears to protect them from the constant barrage. Older residents sat silently, listening to the sound of each impact with a resigned understanding of what it meant. Fear had become a constant presence, settling into the castle with the same inevitability as dusk settling over the horizon. The defenders on the battlements looked down at the siege engines with a mixture of dread and fascination. The machines moved with slow, deliberate power, commanded by teams of soldiers who seemed unaffected by the devastation they created. These were not the swift, chaotic weapons of a battlefield. They were patient tools, built to erode stone and morale at the same time. Every strike carried the same message. The walls were not invincible. The castle, once believed to be a fortress of certainty, was now a structure slowly unraveling under the weight of weapons designed to exploit every weakness. Those inside could only wait for the next impact, hoping it would not be the one that broke through entirely. The siege weapons did more than damage stone. They filled every moment with a tension that tightened like a rope. They reshaped sleep. I thought. Movement. Breath. They chipped away at the confidence of those trapped within the walls, until fear became a companion as constant as the shaking of the ground. The machines outside revealed how fragile the fortress truly was. Each impact carved deeper into the resolve of those trapped within the walls. Beyond that relentless assault, the castle drifted toward a moment where endurance would no longer be enough. Psychological warfare arrived quietly at first, settling over the castle like a cold mist that refused to lift. The residents were already weakened by hunger, sickness, and the constant thunder of siege weapons. Yet the enemy understood that breaking bodies was only one method of victory. Breaking minds, slowly, deliberately, often achieved what force could not. One morning, as dawn struggled to brighten the sky, a guard on the battlements cried out. His voice carried a sound that was neither alarm nor surprise, but something heavier. Those nearby rushed to the wall and saw what had stolen his breath. Outside the gate, suspended from crude wooden frames, hung several bodies. They swayed gently in the wind, their clothing stained with dirt and dried blood. Even from a distance, the castle residents recognized them. Neighbors who had tried to flee weeks earlier, relatives taken in skirmishes, familiar faces twisted by death. The sight hollowed the air. A silence spread across the battlements as people stared down at what remained of those they had once shared meals or conversations with. The enemy had not simply killed them, they had arranged them deliberately, choosing positions and angles where the castle could not avoid seeing them. It was a message written in flesh and shadow. Your fate is visible. Your choice is meaningless. Your suffering inevitable. Those who had lost loved ones trembled uncontrollably. Some clutched the stone wall until their fingers ached. Others turned away, unable to bear the weight of recognition. But the image lingered behind their eyes no matter where they looked. There was no escape from it. Later that same day, small bundles were found scattered inside the courtyard. At first, they looked like debris tossed by the wind. But when the residents opened them, they discovered scraps of parchment covered in hurried handwriting. Some messages claimed that the enemy had breached another nearby fortress. Others insisted that reinforcements had been slaughtered before reaching them. A few letters whispered that surrender would be met with mercy. None of the claims could be verified. Yet every message stirred unrest. More letters appeared over the following days, launched by crude slings or tied to small stones. Some were written in ink, others in charcoal. A few pretended to be from residents inside the castle, accusing individuals of treason or cowardice. The handwriting sometimes mimicked that of real castle inhabitants, creating confusion that cut deeper than any weapon. People began questioning each other with guarded suspicion, unsure what to believe, unsure whom to trust. These psychological blows did not arrive with thunder or fire. They arrived with stillness, slipping into the castle the way sickness had slipped through its corridors. Quietly, effectively, invisibly, the enemy needed no siege engines to spread fear. They used only ink, cloth, rope, and the dead. Children sensed the change even without understanding it. They clung to adults with tightened hands, asking why people whispered more often, why faces looked pale even when no bombardment fell. Parents tried to offer reassurance, but their voices were thin, swallowed by doubts they could not hide. The worst toll came at night. Sleep, already fragile, became nearly impossible. People lay awake, imagining footsteps outside their doors, hearing phantom voices in the corridors. In the darkness, rumors grew sharper, blending into nightmares that continued even after waking. The castle no longer felt like a structure of stone. It felt porous, vulnerable, as though every wall allowed fear to seep in. On one evening, a parchment landed near the inner gate. It carried a simple message written in large, uneven strokes. We know who among you will open the gate. No name was included. Yet the ambiguity itself was a weapon. Every resident wondered if the message referred to someone they knew. Every breath carried a new tension. Trust, already damaged, deteriorated further. People began avoiding conversations altogether. They moved quietly, avoiding eye contact, afraid of saying anything that might be twisted into an accusation. The psychological strain grew heavier than hunger, heavier than sleeplessness. Fear became a companion in every chamber, in every hallway, in every heartbeat. Outside, the bodies continued to hang. When the wind blew strongly, they shifted with a creaking sound that echoed faintly across the courtyard. The sound pierced even the thickest walls, reminding those inside that death was waiting with unhurried patience. The enemy did not need to attack constantly. They only needed to let the castle see what awaited beyond its gates. In time, the psychological pressure shaped the defenders' minds as thoroughly as famine had shaped their bodies. People questioned orders, questioned motives, questioned the meaning of endurance itself. Despair settled in the marrow of the fortress, reducing every attempt at strength into a fragile imitation of hope. Nothing was louder than the quiet unraveling of morale. The enemy's silent tactics seeped deeper than any weapon they launched. Every message and every display chipped away at the castle's ability to hold together. Within this tightening pressure, the fortress edged toward a breaking point carved more by fear than by steel. Death had become so frequent inside the castle that the residents no longer reacted with the same shock they once had. In the early days of the siege, each loss brought mourning, quiet prayers, and an attempt at burial. But when sickness, starvation, and injuries swept through the crowded chambers, the number of bodies grew faster than anyone could manage. The defenders who might have carried the dead outside were too weak to lift them. The ground was too hard to dig. The danger outside the walls made burial impossible. And so the bodies remained. At first, they lay where they fell. A soldier slumped near a stairwell. A mother collapsed beside her child. A healer who had worked until her strength disappeared. People stepped around them carefully, promising to return and give them proper rest. But time eroded these promises. Soon, there were too many bodies and too few living hands to move them. And even when someone attempted to gather the dead, they could not carry them far. Eventually, the courtyard became the only space large enough to place the growing number of corpses. People dragged bodies slowly, pulling them across the stone floors with trembling arms. The sound of fabric scraping the ground, once rare, became a constant whisper. The first few bodies were laid respectfully in a row. Later, there was no room for rows. Bodies were stacked. The pile grew day by day, rising like a grim monument. Clothes stiffened with dirt and blood. Faces tightened in the stillness of death. Limbs twisted in unnatural angles as more bodies were added without room for care. Some people tried to avert their eyes, but the smell forced them to acknowledge the presence of the pile, even when they could not see it. The odour drifted through the castle long before the pile reached its full height. It seeped into corridors, through cracks in doors, across sleeping chambers and storerooms. The air thickened with decay, a heavy mixture of rot and sickness that clung to skin and hair. Breathing became a careful act. People pressed cloth to their faces, though the cloth did little. Some grew nauseated, others fainted. All felt the oppressive weight of the stench. Flies arrived next. At first, only a handful buzzed near the courtyard, circling lazily in the warm air. But as the pile grew, so did the number of insects. Soon, clouds of flies hovered over the bodies, settling in clusters that pulsed with movement. Their buzzing echoed across the stone like a low, restless whisper. Inside the castle, people swatted at them with shaking hands, unable to escape the insect's persistence. Rats followed. Drawn by the scent, they emerged from cracks in the walls and unseen corners, their eyes bright, their bodies thin and fast. They climbed the pile with ease, nibbling at exposed flesh, burrowing into torn clothing. Their presence added a new layer of horror, one that no one dared speak of. Even soldiers grew pale when they saw the creatures moving with such confidence, as though the castle no longer belonged to the living. Disease spread quickly in this environment. The air carried contamination. Hands that touched a doorknob might next touch a child's face. Water scooped from a barrel might contain unseen particles brought by insects. People who had survived hunger or injuries now fell ill simply from breathing the heavy air. Their fevers rose swiftly. Their strength faded within hours. Some residents tried burning herbs to mask the odour, but the smoke only mingled with the smell of decay, creating a dense haze that stung the eyes. Others attempted to move the bodies farther from the living quarters, but their limbs trembled under the weight. It soon became clear that effort was futile. The dead outnumbered the living, and the pile in the courtyard was only the most visible sign of the crisis. There were corners of the castle no one entered anymore, not because of danger from the enemy outside, but because bodies lay forgotten there. A child was found near a collapsed stairway, an elder who died in sleep and was discovered days later. Their remains blended into the background of suffering, their shapes becoming just another part of the darkened chambers. The castle's atmosphere changed entirely. Hope, already fragile, dissolved under the weight of the decay surrounding them. People spoke less. Movement slowed. The sounds of daily life faded until the silence felt oppressive. It was as though the castle itself had begun to rot from within, every stone absorbing the despair of those trapped inside. The enemy outside continued their siege, unaware of the full extent of devastation happening within the walls. They saw smoke rising, heard faint movements, and assumed their tactics were working. They could not imagine the internal collapse fueled not by weapons, but by the growing mountain of the dead. In the end, the bodies in the courtyard were more than evidence of loss. They were a sign the fortress had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. A place where life and death had lost their boundaries. The rising pile revealed how completely the fortress had been overtaken by death. Every breath carried the weight of decay that weakened what little resolve remained. Amid this suffocating atmosphere, the castle neared a point where survival itself felt impossible. Death inside the besieged castle rarely came with the sound of steel. It arrived quietly, slipping into lungs, settling into wounds, and settling deeper into the minds of those who could no longer distinguish exhaustion from defeat. People had prepared for battle, sharpened weapons, reinforced walls, trained their limited strength for combat. But the enemy that weakened them most did not stand outside the gates. It lived in the air, in the corridors, in their own thoughts. Smoke became the first constant companion. After so many fires, both accidental and intentional, the castle never truly cleared. Thin grey layers drifted through the hallways, collecting in shallow waves that pressed against the ceilings and slipped into sleeping chambers. Every breath tasted of the past: burned wood, scorched cloth, and the lingering memory of flames that had taken too much from them. Even when people attempted to cover their mouths with fabric, their lungs filled with the same heavy mixture. Children coughed until their voices cracked. Older residents leaned against walls, trying to find air that felt less sharp. Soldiers patrolling the corridors often stopped mid-step, dizzy from the thickness surrounding them. No one felt rested. No one felt steady. Smoke weakened them slowly, turning strength into fragility with a patience more devastating than any blade. Hunger deepened that fragility. Meals had ceased to resemble food. Some days, people chewed on boiled scraps of leather. Other days, they swallowed bitter water, thickened with crushed roots. Faces grew gaunt. Eyes sank into hollow shapes, and bones emerged beneath thinning skin. The castle felt full of shadows, not because the light had dimmed, but because the bodies moving through it had grown too thin to cast normal ones. Hunger did not only weaken limbs, it changed how people thought. Decisions once made with clarity now took effort. Small disagreements escalated faster. Simple tasks required concentration that people no longer possessed. Even walking down a corridor became a negotiation between will and weakness. Every part of survival demanded energy they no longer had. Fear settled into the remaining space. It came during the day when the walls shook from distant impacts. But it grew deepest at night. The darkness inside the castle felt different now. Heavier, quieter, waiting. People lay still, barely moving, listening for footsteps, for breathing, for anything that might signal danger. In their fragile state, imagination sharpened into something more dangerous than any weapon. Fear conjured shapes from shadows, voices from silence, threats from the simplest movements. Many deaths occurred with no witnesses. A person might collapse in a corridor while fetching water, unnoticed, until someone tripped over the body. Another might slip away during sleep, their shallow breaths fading into nothing before dawn. There were no final words, no rituals, no time for mourning. People learned of deaths the same way they learned of hunger. Slowly, repeatedly, without relief. The combination of smoke, starvation, and fear transformed the castle into something unrecognizable. Rooms once lively with conversation felt hollow. Chambers that once echoed with footsteps now held stagnant air. Even the cold stone seemed to absorb the despair around it, darkening in places where hands had rubbed against it for balance or comfort. In some corners, attempts were made to create cleaner air. People fanned corridors with broken shields, hoping to push smoke toward cracks in the walls. Others lit small fires with herbs meant to mask the odor of decay. But the results were fleeting. The air grew heavy again within minutes. The castle's architecture, designed to trap heat in winter, now traps misery instead. When the walls trembled from another distant impact, few people reacted with fear anymore. They simply looked up, listened, and waited for the shaking to pass. Their bodies no longer had the strength for panic. Even dread required energy, and energy had become a luxury. By now, most residents understood something painful. The enemy outside did not need to breach the gates. The castle was defeating itself. Smoke choked them faster than blades could. Hunger hollowed them more deeply than wounds. Fear dismantled their unity long before any soldier could. These three forces, unseen, constant, and patient, worked together with devastating precision. They consumed the fortress from the inside, leaving the walls intact, but the people undone. No sword could have done this. No arrow. No catapult. No battering ram. Only the slow unravelling of life inside the stone confines. The siege's true devastation rose not from weapons but from the invisible forces that hollowed the castle's spirit. Every day blurred into a struggle shaped by breathlessness, weakness, and dread. Beneath this tightening grip, the fortress drifted toward an ending, carried by forces none of its defenders had prepared to face. Fire became both a shield and a sentence for those trapped inside the besieged castle. People had long relied on burning tar, boiling oil, and makeshift incendiaries to push attackers back from the walls. But each attempt to defend the fortress carried its own danger. Strength was failing. Coordination was fading, and the line between defense and destruction grew thinner with every hour of resistance. The walls, still standing despite countless impacts, trembled whenever defenders hauled heavy pots upward. The stone steps leading to the battlements were slick with soot, grease, and ash. Those who climbed them did so slowly, not out of caution, but because exhaustion made each ascent feel like an impossible task. Breath came in short, shallow gasps. Hands shook even before touching the hot containers. Up on the battlements, the air thickened with heat. Flames flickered in shallow pits where tar was kept burning, turning the parapets into narrow corridors of fire. Sweat mixed with soot, covering the defenders in a dark sheen that made their faces nearly indistinguishable beneath the grime. They leaned over the edges, tipping boiling oil onto wooden ladders, watching flames race up toward attackers who screamed as the liquid clung to their skin. But the defenders no longer celebrated these moments. Each successful strike carried a cost they felt more deeply than victory ever allowed. When oil splashed back upward, droplets burned holes through clothing, skin, and muscle. When the tar overflowed its container, the fire spread across the battlements faster than weakened arms could respond. Some defenders lost their footing, slipping in the chaotic glow, falling into flames that offered no mercy. Ladders, battering ramps, and siege towers burned, but their destruction only added to the chaos. Wind pushed the heat inward, sending sparks drifting across the courtyard. Dry wood, cloth, and weakened supports caught fire instantly. What began as a controlled defensive measure became an unpredictable chain of blazes that reached deeper into the castle than intended. Inside the walls, civilians felt the consequences long before they saw the flames. Hairline cracks in the stone channels allowed smoke to seep downward into living spaces. Children cried as heat pressed against the ceilings. Mothers covered their mouths with whatever fabric they had left, guiding their families toward cooler corners of the keep. Though none of those corners stayed cool for long, the defenders returned from the battlements, stumbling, coughing, and covered in burns. Some had skin peeling from their arms, their wounds glistening in the dim light. Others carried comrades whose legs had given out in the smoke, dragging them through corridors filled with rising heat. The smell of scorched cloth and burned flesh followed them, clinging to the walls long after they passed. People tried to create fire breaks, hoping to slow the internal spread. Buckets were passed hand to hand, though they were almost always half empty. Water was scarce, much of it had been reserved for drinking, even when they managed to reach the growing flames. The water evaporated before touching the surface. The blaze roared louder, strengthened rather than weakened by their efforts. At times, the heat grew so intense that the stone itself cracked. Pieces of the wall split away, falling with dull, heavy thuds. In several towers, wooden floors collapsed entirely, sending debris into rooms filled with smoke. People fled downward, seeking refuge. But the flames followed, creeping through the castle with the same patience that hunger and fear had shown in earlier days. Defenders who remained on the walls watched all of this from above, with hollow eyes. They continued throwing fire onto the enemy because they had to, not because they believed it would save them. Their arms trembled with every motion, their vision blurred in the dense rising smoke. Their wills thinned alongside their strength. Outside, attackers saw the flames licking upward from behind the battlements and understood that the castle was not only fighting them, it was also fighting itself. They pressed harder, sensing the weakening within. The defenders, surrounded by heat on both sides, lost the ability to distinguish victory from failure. Each new fire felt like another boundary collapsing, another reminder that survival was slipping beyond reach. The lines between friend and enemy blurred beneath the shifting glow. Fire consumed both without hesitation. It cared nothing for loyalty, desperation, or intent. It simply burned, filling the castle with a heat that smothered breath, hope, and whatever resolve remained. Every flame poured for protection returned with consequences. Every defensive fire carved away at the fortress itself. By the time night fell, the battlements glowed a faint orange from the heat, still radiating through the stone. The defenders had won no ground. They had only slowed the collapse that the siege had already set in motion. The castle's last defences eroded in the very fires meant to protect it. Every act of resistance fed a blaze that reshaped the fortress from within. Under that shifting glow, the next phase of destruction waited to emerge where fear and exhaustion had already taken hold. Women and children were always moved first when fear began to press against the castle walls. Their footsteps echoed down stone corridors as they were pushed into cellars, storerooms, and cramped chambers that offered no real protection. People believed these places were safer simply because they were hidden. But the air inside was already stale, and the doors closed too tightly. Darkness sat heavy in those rooms, making it difficult to breathe even before the siege took its toll. Mothers wrapped their arms around their children, whispering quiet reassurances they barely believed. Their voices shook, not from panic, but from exhaustion. The stone walls around them vibrated every time a projectile struck the outer defences. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. Some children coughed softly. Others pressed their faces into their mothers' skirts, hoping the darkness would pass quickly. Time moved differently in such confined spaces. Slower, heavier, deeper. The guards who sealed the doors rarely looked anyone in the eye. They carried guilt inside their armor, aware that pushing families into these cramped corners meant condemning them to suffocation long before an enemy ever crossed the gate. But the alternative, allowing them to stay above, risked them being struck by fire, arrows, or debris. There were no good choices in a siege, only directions that leaned toward different kinds of suffering. Inside the chambers, the air grew warmer with every passing hour. People shared the little space they had, shifting against each other, trying to find room to stretch their legs or straighten their backs. Infants cried until their voices broke. Older children stared blankly into the dark, learning fear in a way no lesson should have taught them. The adults tried to ration water, but supplies never lasted long. Thirst hollowed them out, leaving their lips cracked and voices faint. When smoke began seeping into underground rooms, the danger became clearer. It slipped through cracks in the floorboards and narrow openings in the walls, moving slowly at first, then more boldly as fires spread above. The women felt it in their lungs, the sharp edge of heat, the bitter flavor of burnt wood. They covered their children's noses with scraps of cloth, soaking them in the last drops of water to buy a little more time. Their own breaths grew short, but they kept their hands steady for as long as they could. Outside those rooms, the siege dragged on with no sign of easing. As rations diminished, the suffering above intensified. People fought for scraps, argued over the last buckets of water, and collapsed from disease. Women and children, kept isolated for safety, could only hear fragments of what was happening beyond the doors. A scream, a fall, a crash, a tremor. They pieced together the state of the castle through sound rather than sight. When the gates finally weakened, panic surged through every corridor. Some of those locked away were forgotten in the chaos. Others were released too late, stumbling into hallways filled with smoke, bodies, and soldiers who no longer recognized who they were trying to protect. There was no order, no plan, no escape route that led anywhere but deeper into terror. The same rooms that had sheltered them now became traps as flames moved downward and debris blocked the exits. For those who reached the courtyard, the sight awaiting them was worse. The attackers, once kept at bay by stone and flame, flooded into the fortress with a single purpose: to claim victory through brutality. Women were dragged from hiding places or seized as they tried to flee. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. The chaos blurred into a frenzy of shouting, steel, and smoke. No one on either side looked human during those moments, only driven by fear, cha, or cruelty. Some women fought back with bare hands or stones pulled from broken walls. Their resistance was brief but fierce. Others froze, unable to decide whether to run or stand still. Children clung to them, moving even harder. In the confusion, families were separated and sometimes never found again. The siege had already taken their strength. The fall of the castle took the rest. Those who survived the assault faced fates that stretched the suffering far beyond the walls. Captives were marched away, forced into servitude, or sold. Children who witnessed the horrors often carried the life memories, their earliest impressions shaped by fear and loss. The castle, once imagined as a sanctuary, remained only as a ruin behind them, all silent, blackened, and marked by the cost of its final stand. Women and children were the least protected, the least prepared, and yet the ones asked to endure the most. Their suffering rarely appeared in the accounts written later. Chroniclers focused on battles, strategies, and the movements of armies. They seldom recorded the quiet deaths in cellars or the silent terror in hidden corners. But anyone who walked among the remnants after a siege could sense where the deepest tragedies had taken place. Their suffering revealed how the siege carved its deepest wounds into those with the least protection. Every hour spent in cramped darkness exposed the quiet cost no sword or fire could measure. From that fragile corner of the fortress, a harsh truth waited to unfold in ways the defenders were not prepared to face. Prayers rose long before dawn, drifting through narrow corridors where smoke, hunger, and sickness pressed against every stone. The people inside the besieged castle gathered around small altars as if light alone could hold back despair. Their voices were thin, more breath than sound, trembling with exhaustion and fear. Faith had been a constant in their lives, something steady and predictable. But under Sieg, it became something brittle, strained by realities harsher than any sermon had ever prepared them for. The priests moved slowly, weakened by the same lack of food that hollowed the faces of everyone around them. Their robes hung loosely, sleeves swaying over arms that had grown thin. They whispered blessings to families who huddled together on cold floors, trying to offer comfort they no longer felt within themselves. The sweet smell of incense did little to hide the odours rising from the lower chambers, stench created by disease, rot, and bodies that had nowhere left to rest. Still, people knelt, crossing themselves out of habit more than conviction. As the siege dragged on, quiet arguments began to rise between those who still believed and those who felt abandoned by every promise they had been taught. Some insisted that endurance would be rewarded, that these trials were tests of the soul. Others stared blankly at the last flickering candlelight and whispered that their God had turned away. The walls trapped not only bodies but doubts. Doubts that deepened each day. Food failed to arrive. Each hour, another child coughed until the sound faded into silence. In the upper rooms, a few clung desperately to holy relics, pressing small wooden carvings into their palms until the edges cut into their skin. They begged for intervention. En vision, signs, anything that might suggest the siege would break. Nothing changed. Hunger gnawed openly. Fires smouldered in corners where families tried to keep warm. The air was thick with smoke and the echo of prayers unanswered. Rumours soon spread through the fortress. Some said they had heard singing in the night, soft and distant, as though angels lingered near the towers. Others claimed a dark presence moved through the stairwells, pointing to every new sickness as evidence of a curse. Fear made these stories believable, and once fear settled in, it was impossible to remove. People looked over their shoulders even in daylight, not for soldiers, but for something unseen. The priests tried to maintain order by teaching that unity would protect them, but the unity collapsed quickly under starvation. A few families turned their fear outward, accusing neighbours of inviting misfortune with impure thoughts or hidden sins. The idea that suffering must have a cause took hold, growing sharper and more dangerous as food disappeared and disease spread through hall after hall. One night, a loud argument broke out in the chamber near the central courtyard. Someone claimed that a young servant had brought evil into the castle. The accusation was baseless, born from grief and panic. But panic quickly outweighed reason. A crowd formed, torches shaking in their hands, eyes filled with desperation. The priests rushed in, pleading for restraint, insisting no harm should come to the innocent. Their words fell apart in the noise. The girl cried out for help, but the crowd was too frightened to listen. Fear has a way of turning people into something unrecognizable. They dragged her into the courtyard, demanding that her removal would lift whatever curse had settled over the fortress. It happened fast, too fast for anyone to stop. When the flames died down, nothing changed. No wind of relief passed through the halls. No miracle came. The siege continued, silent and merciless. After that night, many stopped praying altogether. The shrines remained, but the candles burned unattended. their light dimming until only smoke remained. Even the priests walked differently, heads lowered, steps uncertain, as though they too questioned every belief they had once carried with certainty. The castle no longer felt like a place touched by the sacred. It felt abandoned, hollowed out, left to suffer without meaning. Outside, the enemy built new engines of war. Inside, faith dissolved into fragments, scattered across rooms where the sick begged for mercy that never arrived. Hunger weakened bodies, doubt weakened spirits. The people no longer spoke of deliverance. They spoke only of waiting. Waiting for water, waiting for food, waiting for relief that never crossed the horizon. By the time the siege reached its deepest point, belief had become a memory rather than a strength. The people did not reject it. They simply no longer had the energy to hold it. Each breath was spent on survival. Each step carried the weight of hopelessness. Prayer had become too heavy to lift. The siege revealed how fragile faith became when pressed beneath hunger, illness, and fear. Every unanswered plea made the walls feel tighter and the silence heavier. Beyond that silence, something darker waited to pull the castle even deeper into despair. Surrender did not arrive as a moment of clarity, but as a slow collapse. Growing quietly in the corners of the fortress, long before anyone spoke the word aloud. People had grown thin, too thin to lift weapons or even stand for long. The corridors echoed with shallow breathing and the coughs of those who no longer had the strength to rise from the floor. The defenders who once patrolled the walls now leaned against them, sliding down into the dust whenever their legs failed. Each hour, another life slipped away silently, leaving behind a body that no one had the strength to bury. The castle's leaders gathered in the war room, though even that term felt hollow. Maps were spread across a table stained with melted wax and old blood. The faces around the room were pale, eyes sunken, hands trembling with fatigue. The debate was not about victory anymore. It had become a question of how long they could delay the inevitable. Messengers reported that no soldiers remained who were strong enough to fight. Entire families were found huddled together in the stairwells, barely conscious. Starvation had reduced the fortress to a place filled with bodies still breathing. But only just. From the highest tower, the enemy's encampment stretched like a metal sea. Rows of tents, Ziga engines, and watchfires that burned through the night. The defenders could hear faint shouts from beyond the walls, reminders that the outside world still had strength even as theirs faded. Once, these sounds had stirred defiance. Now they produced only dread. Every soldier who climbed the steps to the battlements looked down, not with anger, but with resignation, knowing they held no power to repel what waited below. Inside the great hall, the surviving families gathered, their clothes hanging loosely from their frames. People sat close together, not out of comfort, but to preserve warmth. Some whispered prayers, others stared blankly at the stone floor, waiting for someone else to decide their fate. Mothers cradled children too weak to cry. Old men leaned against pillars, eyelids heavy, breath shallow. The hall that once echoed with celebration now held only silence, interrupted by the occasional groan of someone slipping out of consciousness. Talk of surrender grew louder when it became clear that no healthy defenders were left. A single arrow fired from the walls required 3 men. 1 to lift the bow, 1 to draw it, and 1 to steady the shooter when his knees buckled. Armor lay abandoned along the walkway because it was too heavy to lift. Food had disappeared entirely. The wells held only murky water that smelled of metal and rot. Disease had spread through the living quarters, and every morning brought news of more deaths. Some argued that surrender would spare at least the women and children. The enemy, they said, might show mercy if the gates opened willingly. But others knew better. Tales from nearby sieges told of violence unleashed even after white flags were raised. There was no guarantee of kindness, only a chance. Thin and fragile, Yet even a fragile chance was stronger than what remained within the walls. Lords, who once commanded armies, now sat alone, contemplating choices they had never imagined making. For them, surrender was worse than death, a stain that would mark their families for generations. Some refused to consider it. They climbed the tower steps and threw themselves from the parapets, choosing the certainty of the fall over the humiliation they believed awaited them. Others locked themselves in their chambers, ending their lives quietly so that they would not witness the defeat they could not prevent. Eventually, the final decision was made. A group of survivors, too tired to stand without leaning on each other, walked toward the gates with a white cloth tied to a broken spear. The gates that once protected them now felt like the mouth of a grave. When the heavy wood creaked open, the sound echoed through the hollowed halls. Families watched from the shadows, barely breathing, waiting for the enemy's response. In that moment, every heartbeat hung between dread and fragile hope. The enemy entered cautiously at first, lanterns held high, expecting resistance. Instead, they found a fortress filled with bodies lying where they had fallen. Those still alive were too weak to rise. The conquerors moved through the rooms, stepping around the dying, speaking in low voices that replaced the noise of battle with something colder. For the people of the fortress, surrender brought no relief, only the realization that they had nothing left to give. In some corners of the castle, small groups kneeled, praying not for salvation but for the strength to endure whatever came next. Others simply closed their eyes, letting exhaustion carry them into a sleep they hoped would not end in pain. Surrender had not saved them. It had merely marked the final stage of their suffering. The fall of the fortress revealed how desperation could silence even the strongest voices. Every choice was shaped by exhaustion rather than strategy, leaving no path untouched by loss. At the edge of this collapse, something far more brutal waited to take hold of those still clinging to life. Survival inside a besieged castle was never a true ending. For those who endured hunger, sickness, and the slow unraveling of hope, stepping out into the aftermath felt less like deliverance and more like entering another kind of ruin. The siege had already carved their bodies thin and drained their spirits dry. But what waited beyond the broken gates belonged to a world that no longer resembled the one they had fought to protect. The smoke had settled, the shouting had faded, and yet the silence that replaced them felt even heavier. The survivors emerged slowly from the darkness of halls that had turned into tombs. Their steps were unsteady, their eyes unfocused, searching for something familiar in a landscape stripped of meaning. What they saw instead were collapsed towers, scorched beams, and piles of rubble where homes once stood. Ash drifted through the air in thin spirals, sticking to hair and skin. The smell of burned wood clung to everything, mixing with the sour odor of decay. Every breath carried a reminder of the lives lost inside these walls. Outside the gate, the enemy waited, not as liberators, but as victors, deciding the fate of those who remained. Soldiers lined the road, weapons lowered but ready, watching with the cold curiosity of men who had seen too much death to feel anything at all. Some whispered to one another, pointing at the survivors as though observing a strange species. Others simply stared, expressionless, as the weakened defenders stumbled forward. The first wave of survivors was separated immediately. Young women pulled aside. Older men dragged away. Children counted with quick, indifferent glances. There was no ceremony, no explanation. Assignments were made with gestures, not words. The conquerors did not care who these people had been, whether they were nobles, servants, soldiers, or farmers. The siege had erased those distinctions long before the gates opened. A woman clutched her daughter's hand, refusing to let go even as soldiers shouted at her. When one of them pulled the child away, the woman collapsed, pleading with a voice so hoarse it barely rose above a whisper. Her cries were ignored. The child was taken toward a cart, filled with others, none of them daring to speak. The woman's hands scraped the dirt as she tried to crawl after her. But exhaustion won, leaving her trembling in the dust. Nearby, a man attempted to resist when soldiers tied his arms. But his strength was gone before the struggle even began. He had survived starvation, only to fall under the weight of a blade pressed lightly against his throat. The soldiers did not kill him. They pushed him into a line of captives destined for labor. A future carved by chains rather than swords. His eyes drifted toward the ruined castle behind him, as if hoping to see something that would anchor him. Nothing remained but broken stones. Inside the courtyard, execution pits were already being prepared. Those who had fought until the last moment were judged too dangerous to keep alive. Some were brought forward in silence, too weak to stand. Others were dragged by their clothing, leaving faint trails in the dirt. The sounds of pleading, screaming, and prayer mingled into a dull hum. For every survivor who lived past the siege, another fell in these final moments, not by hunger, but by the judgment of their conquerors. As the sun climbed higher, the ruins grew brighter, revealing the full extent of what had been lost. Birds circled overhead, drawn by the smell of bodies still unburied. Smoke rose from distant piles where debris continued to burn. The castle, once a symbol of strength, now looked like a monument to suffering. Walls that had once promised safety now stood only as reminders that no stone, however thick, could protect against time, starvation, or human cruelty. Some survivors wandered among the wreckage, touching stones, fragments of tapestries, shattered pottery, objects that once held meaning. Their faces showed no expression, as though grief itself had become too heavy to lift. A few knelt beside the dead, whispering quiet apologies. Others stared blankly at the horizon, uncertain whether they still had a future to walk toward. As day turned to dusk, the conquerors gathered their captives and prepared to march away from the ruins. The survivors did not look back. The castle had nothing left to offer them. Even those who lived had lost something vital: family, dignity, faith, or the belief that survival itself was a victory. They had endured the siege. But endurance was not freedom. It was merely the doorway to a different kind of suffering. Night settled slowly over the ruins, filling every collapsed chamber with a cold stillness. Nothing stirred except the wind. The siege had ended, but its consequences had only begun. The aftermath revealed that enduring the siege did not guarantee a gentler fate. Every survivor carried wounds that no victory could soothe. On the other side of ruin, a deeper darkness waited, shaped by cruelty that outlived the final breach in the walls. A castle was never meant to be a grave. Yet by the end of a siege, that was often what remained. The walls stood tall, still catching the light of morning and evening. But the life inside them had already dissolved long before the final flag fell. Stones built for protection slowly became barriers that trapped breath, movement, and hope. What had once been a symbol of strength turned quietly into a vessel of suffering, its halls echoing with the faint reminders of those who had fought hardest to live. Walking through the ruins after the siege ended was like stepping into the memory of a world that had been scraped clean of colour. The courtyard, once alive with footsteps and daily tasks, lay empty except for scattered debris, broken arrows, pieces of collapsed timber, and burned fabric covered the ground. Each object told a story of the moment it had fallen, but none of them revealed the full weight of the fear that had filled these spaces. Only the silence explained, a silence heavy enough to press against the chest. Inside the great hall, the air still tasted of smoke and dust. Long wooden tables where people once shared warmth and conversation remained overturned, their legs splintered. The hearth, once a source of comfort, was dark and cold. Ash covered the stone floor in soft drifts, settling where bodies had been carried or dragged. The banners that once hung with pride along the walls were torn or burned, some reduced entirely to blackened threads. What lingered in this hall was not defeat, but the residue of endurance, thin, fragile, and barely recognizable. Rooms deeper inside the fortress held reminders of how slowly life had slipped away. Straw mats that once offered rest now rested untouched, abandoned in the rush for safety that never arrived. Jugs of water sat cracked and empty. Food stores had been scraped clean, leaving behind only stains where grain or dried meat once lay. In darker corners, the remnants of illness were still visible. Cloths soaked in fluids, makeshift bedding for the dying, bowls abandoned mid-use when strength failed. These spaces carried the quiet truth that the enemy at the gates had never been the most lethal threat. The well, once a lifeline, stood as a testament to how fragile that lifeline had been. The water at the bottom was cloudy, still, and undrinkable. A rope hung loosely over the edge, frayed from desperate use. People had gathered here day after day, hoping for relief. But the well had not offered salvation. It had become a reminder that even the most essential sources of life could turn against those who depended on them. The narrow stairwells, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, now felt narrower than ever. Dust coated each step. Torches long extinguished left the passages dim, where only thin beams of light pierced through cracks in the stone. The darkness preserved the memory of the people who had huddled here, pressed together for warmth, clutching children or small belongings, anything that anchored them to a world outside the siege. For many, these stairwells had been the last place they spoke or touched another human being. Now, they held only the faint echo of breaths no longer drawn. The deepest chambers of the castle, the cellars and storage rooms, were the most haunting. These places, meant for keeping goods, became refuges for those too weak to remain above. Here, the air hung heavy and still. Not a single window offered a view of escape. People had whispered their final thoughts into the darkness, their words dissolving before reaching another ear. When the siege ended, some bodies were found in these rooms, lying together, as though the last comfort they could offer one another was proximity. Beyond the interiors, the landscape around the fortress revealed what happened when walls became both prison and shield. The fields that once fed the castle were scorched, their soil dry and cracked. The path leading to the gate bore the imprints of soldiers, refugees, and those dragged unwillingly into captivity. These marks created a tapestry of movement, each step representing urgency, fear, or resignation. And yet, in the aftermath, the path was empty. No one walked here by choice anymore. Those who survived rarely lingered. They carried the weight of everything they had seen inside these walls. And for many, this weight was heavier than hunger or exhaustion. Some left without looking back. Others paused only long enough to whisper a name or a farewell. The castle that had defined their lives no longer felt like home. It felt like a boundary they needed to cross in order to breathe again. Nothing tied them to the stone, except memories they preferred to release rather than keep. Among the ruins, the concept of victory meant little. The enemy may have claimed the fortress, but what they took was only a broken shell. The people inside had lost far more: family, security, belief, dignity. The siege had spared few, and even those it spared physically were changed in ways the outside world would never fully understand. The castle itself stood as a monument not to the strength of its builders, but to the vulnerability of those who depended on it. History often portrayed castles as symbols of safety, yet this illusion crumbled each time a siege began. The high walls, designed to protect, also prevented escape. The gates that blocked invaders also trapped residents. The towers that offered vantage points also provided no route to salvation. And when collapse came, it came not from the stones, but from the lives contained within them. Death seeped through the corridors long before any breach occurred. In the end, the castle remained standing, its stones unbroken in many places, its silhouette unchanged from a distance. But anyone who stepped inside knew it no longer represented stability or power. It had become a collective burial ground, a place where suffering accumulated layer by layer until nothing else could grow. Time would soften the edges of the ruins and carry away the ashes. But the echo of what happened here would endure. These walls would forever hold the memory of the people who discovered too late that the fortress meant to save them had become their final enclosure. To gaze upon such a place after the siege was to confront the quiet truth that survival and safety were not the same. One could live through the siege and still be lost. One could leave the fortress and still carry its darkness. What remained was not hope, but understanding, a grim realization that strength built from stone could not compete with the fragility stored within human bodies and human fear. As the final embers of sunset touched the highest tower, the castle cast a long shadow across the fields, a reminder that even structures meant to protect could betray the people who trusted them. And in that shadow lay the stories of all who had walked, breathed. We fought and died here. The fortress was still tall, but it was, unmistakably, a grave. Thank you for wandering through these ruins with me, for listening to the quiet stories held in stone and ash. May your night be softer than the nights lived inside these walls, and may rest come to you with ease. Good night, wherever you are, and may the darkness outside your window be gentler than the darkness held by this forgotten fortress.